Her hand found the pull bar before full light, the wood worn smooth in the center where she always gripped it. The ground was cold enough that her breath came out in a thin, flat shape and disappeared. She leaned into the bar and the chicken tractor moved forward 6 feet, the runners scraping a shallow line in the frost-stiffened soil. And inside the pen, the hens shuffled and murmured and found their feet again, without any real alarm. Miriam didn't look at the hens. She looked at the ground behind the pen, at the patch of earth the birds had just vacated, scratched and turned, and left darker than the gray field around it. She stood there for a moment with her hands still on the bar. Then she went to fill the waterers. That is where this story begins. Not with the laughing, though there was laughing. Not with the harvest, though that came too. It begins with a woman's hand on a wooden bar before sunrise, and with the habit of looking at the ground behind the work rather than the work itself. One more thing before we go back to the beginning. The title of this video uses the word girl. That is what some of the older men in Bishop Schlabach's district called Miriam Yost. In the autumn, she turned 28. A girl. She was a widow of 5 years, the sole operator of 12 acres on the Wayne County line, and she had recently paid $30.75 for 41 chickens everyone agreed were worthless. This is the story of what she did with them, and the word girl will sort itself out by the end without any help from me. Miriam Troyer married Jonas Yost in May of the year she turned 21, in a ceremony held at her father's farm outside Sugar Creek. Jonas was 24. He had 12 acres on the Kilbuck Creek bottomland, inherited from an uncle, and the land was not particularly good land, but it was land, and Jonas was not a particularly complicated man, but he was a steady one. And Miriam understood both of these facts clearly when she married him, and considered them sufficient. They were married 26 months. In the 3rd month of the 3rd year, Jonas woke with abdominal pain that he described as stomach upset, because he was the kind of man who described things as less than they were, so as not to make trouble for anyone. By the time Miriam had convinced him to let her send for help, the appendix had been dead for several hours. He died on a Tuesday afternoon in a hospital in Millersburg, 4 days after the pain began, and Miriam was 23 years old and sitting in a plastic chair in a corridor when it happened. She was not present in the room. She has never spoken about this publicly, and the narrator has no business speculating about it. What is known is that she drove back to the farm with her father-in-law, that she fed the chickens they had at the time before she came inside, and that she was back at the farm the following morning and every morning after that. Jonas's older brother Rudy assumed she would sell. He was not unkind about it. He came to see her in October, 6 weeks after the funeral, and sat at the kitchen table and explained patiently the various options available to her for the property and what each of them would return. He had a list. Miriam listened to the whole list. Then she said she was not selling and offered him coffee. Rudy took the coffee and left the list on the table, and that was that. The 2 winters that followed were winters of reading. The bishop's wife, Hannah Schlabach, lent her an Ohio State Extension publication on soil management for small acreage vegetable operations. This led Miriam to a soil science correspondence booklet from the county NRCS office, which she read twice, making small marks in the margins with a pencil. She was not a fast reader and she did not pretend to be, but she read the same paragraph as many times as it required. She learned what cation exchange capacity was. She learned what compaction did to root elongation. She learned what the soil in her south field had been through under the previous tenancy, which had run continuous corn for 11 years on ground that needed rotation and cover crops and a reason to rest, and had received none of these things. The south field was 7 acres of clay-heavy bottomland that had produced in her first 3 growing seasons a diminishing return of root vegetables. In the first year, the beets were acceptable. In the second year, the carrots were bitter and the turnips cracked. In the third year, the produce buyers at the Walnut Creek auction began politely declining her root vegetables or offering her a floor price she could not build a market on. One buyer, a woman named Carol Dresser, who had been coming to the auction for 11 years, picked up a bunch of Miriam's carrots, turned them in her hand, and set them back down without comment. That was the third autumn. The south field had 310 pounds per square inch of resistance at 6 inches depth when Miriam borrowed the penetrometer from the NRCS office in Millersburg the following spring. A healthy pasture field runs somewhere between 150 and 200. Hers was more than 50% over that, and the number did not surprise her. She had been walking that field for 3 years. She knew what compacted ground felt like underfoot. She just needed the number. She was thinking about the south field on the afternoon in mid-September when she drove her market wagon back from the Walnut Creek produce auction along the county road that ran past Dale Schuster's property. She was not thinking about chickens. She was thinking about nitrogen and the rate at which a cover crop of crimson clover would or would not move her soil pH from 5.9 toward the 6.4 or 6.5 she needed for beets to stop being bitter. She was running the math on how much lime she could afford, and how long lime took to act, and how many seasons she likely had left before the south field became, in any practical sense, unworkable. Then she looked through the gap in Dale Schuster's windbreak and stopped thinking about lime. The strip of ground visible through that gap, running along his fence line for perhaps 30 yards, was green in a way the surrounding ground was not. Not end-of-season green, not volunteer green, the kind of green that comes from soil that has been eating well for several seasons, from tilth that has enough organic matter to hold moisture at the top and let roots go down easily. It was a narrow strip, maybe 8 feet wide, and it ran the entire length of the fence line Miriam could see, and it was under chickens. She could see the wire pen from the road. She had driven past it dozens of times in 3 years and registered it as Schuster's chicken setup and nothing more. Today she looked at the ground under the fence line strip, and then she looked at Schuster's corn ground 50 feet beyond it, and the difference between the two was the difference between a field that had been answered and a field that had been only asked. Schuster's farm truck was parked by the barn, and there were crates stacked near the door. She turned her wagon up his drive. Dale Schuster was 61 and had been a conventional poultry and row crop farmer for 35 years. He was not unfriendly. He explained, as Miriam stood by the crates and looked at the birds inside them, that he was consolidating his operation. He had a lease dispute with the neighboring parcel that had gone against him, and he was cutting his flock to reduce overhead. These birds were 18 months old, Rhode Island Red Crosses, good layers but past peak commercial production. He had a processor scheduled for Friday. Miriam asked him what he wanted for them. Schuster looked at her. He looked at the birds. He said 75 cents a head. There were 41 birds in the crates. She did the multiplication in her head, counted out $30.75 from the envelope she kept in the wagon box for auction purchases, and loaded 41 crates into the wagon bed. Before she left, she walked the fence line strip and stood on the ground at the end of it. It gave slightly under her boot. Not soft, just not locked. She could feel the difference from 12 inches away when she stepped off Schuster's ground onto the road shoulder. She did not say anything about this to Schuster. She thanked him for the birds and drove home. Levi Troyer was driving back from the grain elevator when he passed Miriam's wagon on the county road. He saw the crates. He saw the birds. He slowed his horse enough to look, then continued on. That evening he mentioned it to his wife, and his wife mentioned it to her sister, and her sister was Ruth Byler, and Ruth Byler had a gift for distribution. By the following Sunday, which was an in-between Sunday for their church district and therefore a social one, Ruth had told 6 people that Miriam Yost had bought 60 chickens from Dale Schuster, spent good money, and was planning to drag them back and forth across her dead south field in some scheme she'd read about in an English farm bulletin. Miriam was not at the Sunday gathering because she was home managing the birds through their first 72 hours, which is the period when transported poultry are most likely to go off feed or develop respiratory stress from the exertion of relocation. She did not know what Ruth had said. She found out the following week when Ezra Mast, who ran the harness shop in Charm, and who had stopped by the farm to deliver a repaired breast collar she had sent in, asked her how 60 chickens were settling in. 41, Miriam said. She was carrying a waterer across the yard when she said it. She did not stop walking. 38 eating normally, 3 sluggish but upright. Ezra watched her go. He had known Miriam Yost since she was a girl in the actual sense of the word, when she was a girl and he was a boy, and both of them were in the same one-room school outside Sugar Creek. He was 31 now and she was 28, and he was not entirely sure what he was watching her do in the south field with the wooden pens he could see from the drive. But he had learned over the years that Miriam Yost generally knew what she was doing. He reported back to Ruth that it was 41 birds, not 60. Ruth said she had heard 60 from a very reliable source. Ezra said the reliable source had been off by 19 and left it there. The 3 sluggish hens were a predictable consequence of transport stress in mature laying birds. One recovered fully by day 3 and began eating aggressively enough to push the other hens off the feed trough, which Miriam took as a good sign. The other 2 remained subdued, eating some but not ranging to scratch, resting more than working. By day 5 they had both stabilized, and by day 7 they were indistinguishable from the rest of the flock. Miriam noted the recovery date in her account book, a small cloth-covered ledger she had bought at the dry goods store in Walnut Creek for 40 cents. The account book was her instrument for the whole of this project. It had a column for dates, a column for hen counts and observations, and a column she had headed Soil, in which she recorded penetrometer readings, pH test results, and earthworm counts by strip number. The strips were numbered 1 through 14 running north to south across the south field, each strip approximately half an acre, and roughly the width of 2 chicken tractors running side by side. The plan was to move the pens 6 feet forward each morning, working each strip until the hens had covered it completely, then move the pens to the next strip. At 6 feet per day, covering a strip of approximately 220 feet of length required about 37 moves, which, at the pace Miriam was managing, translated to 6 or 7 weeks per strip. She had 2 chicken tractors when she started, which meant she could work 2 strips simultaneously. She built the 3rd tractor over 3 evenings in the first week, using lumber salvaged from a collapsed equipment shed at the back of the property. The frame was 2x4 fir, the floor open, the sides and roof framed and covered with 2-inch poultry wire. It was not beautiful. It was square, and it was solid, and it kept the birds on the ground she needed them on. She moved it by a pull bar she fitted to one end. The whole thing could be dragged by one person across flat or gently graded ground without significant effort, which described the south field adequately. 3 tractors running simultaneously with the flock divided across them by rough thirds meant approximately 13 or 14 birds per pen. This was within range for the pen dimensions, roughly 10 feet by 12 feet, which gave each bird about 9 square feet of ground at any given time. Crowding causes stress and reduces the ranging behavior that makes the system work. Miriam had read this, and she had also simply watched chickens enough to know it without having read it. The baseline soil reading she recorded on day 4 of the project Strip 1, was 312 pounds per square inch at 6-inch depth. pH was 5.9, measured with a test kit from Miller's Farm Supply and Charm, the same kit she had been using for 2 years, and which she trusted to within 1/10 of a unit. Earthworm count in a 1 square foot sample at 6-inch depth in Strip 1, 2 worms. She recorded all 3 numbers, dated the entry, and put the account book back inside her apron pocket. The field looked like a dead field. She knew it would look like a dead field for some time. That was not a problem she needed to solve. It was a condition she needed to wait through. The work in October was cold work. The ground was not yet frozen, but the mornings were in the 30s by the second week of the month, and the waterers iced over occasionally overnight, which required Miriam to be out early enough to break the ice before the birds had gone too long without water. She set her internal clock, which was reliable, for 5:15. She was at the waterers by 5:30 most mornings. The pen moved done by 5:45, and back inside for breakfast before her neighbor's rooster had stopped announcing himself. The chickens themselves were not remarkable. They were 18-month-old Rhode Island Red Crosses doing what Rhode Island Red Crosses do, which is scratch and peck and dust bathe and manure the ground beneath them with the focused industry of animals that have no awareness of and no interest in the larger project they are participating in. A laying hen deposits approximately 0.03 pounds of nitrogen per day in her manure. Across 38 working hens, that was roughly 1 pound of nitrogen going into the soil every day, concentrated in the strip under the pens, worked slightly into the surface by the scratching. This was not the whole of what the hens were doing. The scratching itself was breaking the compaction crust at the surface. The manure was feeding microbial populations in the soil that had been suppressed under continuous corn and the herbicide regimen that had accompanied it. The bird's weight, distributed across many small feet moving constantly, was not the same as the weight of tillage equipment, which compresses rather than aerates. These were not thoughts Miriam was having consciously on any given morning. They were the physical facts of the system she was running, and she trusted the facts to accumulate in the soil the way she trusted cold to accumulate toward winter. At the Walnut Creek produce auction in the 3rd week of October, she ran into Levi Troyer at the seller's entrance. Levi was 63 years old and farmed 200 acres of corn and soybeans in the Charm Township area, and had opinions that were generally large and stated without much hesitation. He asked her how the South Field project was going. She said it was going. He said he had heard she was moving spent birds around the field, and he wanted to make sure she understood that compaction like what she had in that ground was not something a few chickens were going to fix, that she needed either deep tillage with the right equipment, which she did not have, or to let the ground rest for several seasons and go to a nitrogen-fixing cover crop, which he would be happy to advise her on. Miriam said, 38 hens, Levi. Moving about 6 feet a day. We'll see. Levi said the ground was dead. Miriam said ground doesn't die from compaction and lack of rotation. It sleeps. She bought a cup of coffee from the canteen table and went to find a parking spot for her wagon. Levi stood for a moment watching her go. He had known Miriam Yost since before she was Miriam Yost. He had known her father for 40 years. He was not a cruel man, and he did not wish her project to fail. He simply had very confident ideas about what failed ground looked like and what could and could not be done about it, and his ideas had been formed on much larger acreage over many more seasons than Miriam's, and they did not include chickens. He mentioned to Ruth Byler at the next quilting frolic that he had spoken to Miriam and that she was persisting with the scheme, and that he hoped she was not putting good money and time into a field that was past the point of return. Ruth told 4 people before she got home that Miriam Yost had told Levi Troyer to his face that she knew more about ground than he did. November came. The hens worked strip 2. The ground was cold and the scratching was shallower, But the manure continued. Miriam moved the pens every morning. She recorded the counts. 38 hens, 38 hens, 38 hens. She was not counting down. She was counting steady, which is a different thing. By the 4th week of November, strip 1 had been resting for 6 weeks, and Miriam took a comparison reading. Penetrometer at 6 inches, 287 pounds per square inch, down from 312. Not dramatic, not the kind of number you would report to anyone expecting a quick result. She wrote it in the account book. She wrote the date next to it. She did not say anything about it to anyone, because no one had asked. The 6th week of the project came in the 3rd week of November, and it brought 2 losses and 1 number that Miriam looked at for a long time before she closed the book. The first loss was a predator breach. She found the evidence on a Wednesday morning. A section of wire at the base of the middle tractor had been pulled away from the frame, almost certainly by a raccoon, and 1 hen was gone. She found some feathers at the edge of the field, which was all that remained. She repaired the wire that morning with staples and a hammer, added a second layer of wire at the base of the frame, and staked the bottom rail to the ground with metal pins to prevent lifting. Then she updated the count. 37 hens. The second loss came 4 days later. A hen found dead in the corner of the eastern tractor at morning check. No evident trauma. No sign of illness in the birds around her. Older hens in relocated flocks experience a rate of unexplained sudden death that sits somewhere between 2 and 5% in the first 3 months. Miriam had been expecting a loss of this kind. She had not known which bird or when, but she had expected it. She removed the bird, noted the date, and wrote the count. 36 hens. She stood at the eastern tractor for a moment, her hand resting on the pull bar, looking at the 36 birds moving around inside. They were eating. They were scratching. They had no opinion about the loss of the bird in the corner. Miriam had read that poultry do not mourn in any way that researchers have been able to measure, and she believed this and found it, on the whole, practical. She would have preferred not to lose the bird. She noted the cause as unknown, the date, and the count, and moved the pens their 6 feet and went to fill the waterers. That same week, she pulled a soil sample from strip 1 and ran the pH test. The number was 6.2. She had started at 5.9. She had been working strip 1 for 6 weeks with 36 to 38 birds, moving the pens across it daily, depositing nitrogen and breaking the surface crust, and letting the manure work down through the compaction layers into a soil that had not had organic material added to it in any meaningful way for 11 years. 6 weeks of this work had moved the pH by 0.3 units. That is not, by any measure, a fast result, but it was a result. She wrote it in the account book and drew a small line under it and closed the book. She did the earthworm count next. The protocol she was using was simple. A 1 square foot sample from 6-inch depth, counted by hand. In the baseline reading 6 weeks earlier, strip 1 had shown 2 earthworms per square foot. The reading she took now showed 11. 11 earthworms per square foot in a strip that had shown 2. Earthworms do not migrate quickly. A population increase from 2 to 11 in 6 weeks is not migration. It is reproduction. The conditions had become favorable enough, the organic matter input sufficient enough, that the population already present in the soil, suppressed and minimal, had begun to recover. Earthworms aerate soil as they move through it. They pull organic matter down into lower layers. They produce castings that improve soil structure at a microscopic level that no tillage implement can replicate. Their presence in that density, in that strip in November, was not a dramatic sign. It was an early sign, which is a different thing. And in Miriam's experience, early signs required the same response as any other sign. which was to continue the work and see what they became. She wrote 11 in the column and put the account book in her apron pocket and thought, standing in the gray November field with her breath visible in front of her, that the ground was not finished. Not nearly. Now let me tell you what is actually happening in that soil, because it matters to the rest of the story. Chicken manure deposited directly onto ground is one of the higher nitrogen organic inputs available to a small farm, running roughly 1.1% nitrogen by fresh weight, alongside phosphorus and potassium in proportions that balance well for vegetable ground. Spread thin and moved forward daily rather than piled in one place, it does not burn, it feeds. The scratching the birds do simultaneously breaks the hardpan crust that forms on compacted clay soil, the thin sealed layer that prevents water infiltration and root penetration both. Underneath that crust, once it is broken and the organic input begins working through it, the microbial populations that have been dormant under continuous chemical cropping begin to recover. The pH shifts as the microbial balance shifts. The earthworms return because they have something to eat. The earthworms aerate the deeper layers. The deeper layers begin slowly to resemble soil rather than substrate. None of this is fast. All of it is real. Miriam did not learn this from a book exactly. She learned it by looking at a narrow green strip behind Dale Schuster's fence line on a September afternoon and understanding, without needing to articulate it, what she was seeing. Some people look at a dead field and see a dead field. Some people look at a dead field and see a field that hasn't been asked the right question yet. Ezra Mast stopped by the harness shop in the first week of December on a Thursday afternoon when Miriam came in to pick up a repaired trace. He was a careful talker, Ezra. He did not begin a thing until he was ready to begin it. He fitted the trace over the counter and made sure the repair was clean. And then he said, without quite looking at her, that he had heard from Ruth Byler that the South Field project was not going well. Miriam paid for the trace. She said, 36 hens. Ground's not finished yet. Neither are the hens. Ezra said he had told Ruth as much, though in somewhat different language. Miriam said she appreciated that. Ezra said Ruth had also mentioned he wasn't sure if this was relevant, that Levi Troyer had offered to come by in the spring with his deep till equipment at no charge if she wanted to take a different approach to the ground. Miriam picked up the trace. She said that was kind of Levi and that she would keep it in mind. She put on her coat. She said, Ezra, that field has been compacted and depleted for 11 years. 36 chickens doing 6 feet a day cannot fix 11 years in 6 weeks. She said she knew that. She was looking for what 6 weeks could do, and then what 12 weeks could do, and then what the whole winter of rest could do after that. Ezra looked at her. He said, So you think it's working? She was at the door. She said, I think the earthworms think it's working. She left. Ezra stood behind the counter for a moment. Then he went back to his work. The third week of November had shown 11 earthworms per square foot in strip 1, 36 hens working strips 3 and 4, a pH of 6.2 in the strip that had been resting for 6 weeks, a penetrometer reading of 287 psi down from 312, numbers that would not impress anyone who did not know what the starting numbers had been. Miriam knew what the starting numbers had been. She wrote the new ones under the old ones, in the same small columns, in the same cloth-covered account book. The cold came. The hens scratched in the frost-stiffened ground of strip 3, and the numbers held where they were, 36, 36, 36, and the field looked like what it had always looked like, gray and tired and written off by everyone who passed it on the county road. The ground was not finished. Not finished yet. December arrived the way December arrives in Holmes County, not with a single hard freeze, but with a slow withdrawal of light and warmth over the course of 2 weeks, until one morning Miriam walked out to the pens and understood that the ground was done for the season. Not dead. Done. There is a difference, and she had said so to Levi Troyer, and she believed it about ground the same way she believed it about other things. She did not discuss with Levi Troyer. She moved the hens into winter housing on the 9th of December. The portable shelter was a 3-sided structure she had framed from the same salvaged lumber as the tractors, with a south-facing open front that she covered at night with a heavy canvas drop she could raise in the mornings to let in whatever light the season offered. 2 100-pound propane tanks ran a barn heater mounted high on the back wall. The whole structure sat on skids so it could be moved, though in winter she left it stationary on the north end of the property, near the existing chicken yard, away from the south field. The hens went into it without ceremony. They found the roosts. They settled. 36 hens in winter housing, consuming feed without producing any field work, were a cost Miriam had accounted for before she bought them. Feed for 36 laying hens through a Holmes County winter, roughly mid-December through late March, ran to about 800 pounds of layer pellets at current prices, which she had calculated against the potential return from the field in the following season. The math had not been comfortable, but it had been clear enough. She had done it twice, once in September after she came home from Schuster's with the birds, and once in November when she knew the hen count would hold at 36. The numbers did not change enough between the two calculations to change the decision. The south field rested. Miriam used December and January the way she had used the previous 2 winters, reading and planning. She pulled out the account book in the evenings and looked at the columns. Strip 1, baseline, 312 psi, pH 5.9, 2 earthworms. Strip 1, week 6, 287 psi, pH 6.2, 11 earthworms. Strip 2, baseline, 304 psi, pH 5.8, 3 earthworms. Strip 2, week 6, 291 psi, pH 6.1, 9 earthworms. She'd only gotten 2 strips through a full rotation before winter stopped the work. She had 12 strips remaining. The next season would need to run the hens through as many strips as she could manage before the ground froze again in late fall. And she needed to be planting into strips 1 and 2 by late April if she was going to have a harvestable root vegetable crop for the late summer auction. She built a cold frame in January from 2 old storm windows in a low lumber box, south-facing against the barn wall, and started beet seedlings in it in late February. The variety was Detroit dark red, which she had grown before with acceptable results in better soil, and which she had reason to believe would respond well to the improved tilth in the first 2 strips. She also started Danvers 126 carrots and purple top white globe turnips from seed she had saved from the previous season. She did this without mentioning it to anyone, not because she was secretive by nature, but because she had found over the past 3 years that describing a plan before it had produced anything was a way of spending energy she would rather spend on the plan itself. In February, at the Walnut Creek Produce Auction's indoor winter market, which ran on reduced hours for the local growers who kept winter crops, Ruth Byler found her at the egg table. Ruth was a warm woman and a thorough one, and she could cover more conversational ground in 4 minutes than most people managed in an hour. She asked about the chickens. She said she had heard, from someone who had driven past the property, that the south field still looked the same as it always had. She said this gently, the way people say things gently when they mean them as a warning. Miriam said, 36 hens. Ground rests in winter. That's the point of winter. Ruth said she supposed that was true. Miriam said the hens were healthy and the propane consumption was within what she had planned for. Ruth said that was good. She said, also gently, that Levi had mentioned his offer of the deep till equipment still stood, that the offer was genuine, and she hoped Miriam knew it was meant kindly. Miriam said she knew it was meant kindly. She said she appreciated it. She did not say she would take it, because she would not take it. and she did not say why in any detail that Ruth would be able to distribute, because there was no distribution that would help anything at this stage. She sold Ruth a dozen eggs, and Ruth went to find someone else to talk to, and Miriam stood at the table and thought about strip 3 and what it would look like in April. The winter was not a hard one by Holmes County standards, though there were 2 weeks in January where the temperature did not climb above 15 degrees Fahrenheit, and Miriam was checking the propane levels every morning before the birds were up. She did not lose a hen to cold. The shelter design held. The canvas front kept the wind out and the heater kept the temperature inside the shelter above freezing without running the tanks down faster than she had planned. She noted this in the account book because she wanted to know for the following year what a normal winter cost in propane and what a cold spell added. 36 hens, January. 36 hens, February. The count held like something patient. March came gray and wet, which is how March comes to the Killbuck Creek bottomland, the frost going out of the ground in a slow withdrawal that leaves the low areas soft and the high spots deceptive. Miriam walked the south field in the second week of March and pushed the penetrometer into the ground at the north end of Strip 1, where the chickens had finished their work in October. The reading was 241 psi. She pushed it into the unrehabbed ground at Strip 8 as a control. The reading was 318 psi. She wrote both numbers down, standing in the wet field with mud on her boots, and she looked at the difference between them for a long moment. 241 against 318. Over a winter's rest, the strip that the chickens had worked had continued to improve without any additional input. The microbial activity that the manure and the scratching had started in the fall had continued under the snow. The earthworms had continued moving. The structure of the soil in that strip had changed in a way that was now measurable with a simple instrument borrowed from a government office, standing in a field in March, without any audience at all. She went home and made coffee and sat at the kitchen table with the account book and looked at the columns for a long time. Not with satisfaction exactly. With the particular attention of someone confirming that the thing they believed was happening is, in fact, happening. It is a quiet feeling. It does not require anyone else to be in the room. She moved the hens back to the field on April 3rd, when the ground had firmed enough in the southern half of the field to support the pen runners without rutting. She began with Strip 3, where the hens had been working when winter stopped them, and she ran all 3 tractors simultaneously across Strips 3, 4, and 5. She moved the pens 6 feet every morning. She recorded the counts. The count was 36, and it stayed 36, and the hens went to work on the spring ground with the focused industry they had applied to the fall ground, indifferent to the season and indifferent to the question of what the soil readings in the account book said. On April 14th, she planted strips 1 and 2. She had amended both strips with a light application of wood ash from the winter stove, which she had been saving in a covered bin since December, to help push the pH the remaining distance toward the target. She raked both strips by hand to a depth of 4 inches, which in the worked ground moved easily compared to what the same rake had done in that same field 2 years earlier, when she had broken a tine trying to work a strip on the eastern edge. The soil in strips 1 and 2 was not perfect. It was not the kind of black tillable ground that the best Holmes County farms carry naturally. But it opened under the rake and it did not clump the way clay-heavy, depleted soil clumps. And when she pressed her thumb into it at the seed depth she was targeting, the soil received the pressure and held the impression and did not seal over immediately. She planted Detroit dark red beets at 3/4 inch depth, 1 inch apart in rows 12 inches wide. She planted Danvers 126 carrots at 1/2 inch depth in rows 10 inches wide. She planted purple top white globe turnips at 1/2 inch depth in rows 12 inches wide. She planted one row of Jacob's cattle dry beans along the eastern edge of Strip 1 as a test planting, not expecting a commercial quantity, wanting to know what a legume would do in this soil at this stage. She marked the end of each row with a small stick and a torn piece of feed bag pressed over it, not labeled because she knew what she had planted and where. The same day, in the same field 50 feet north, strips 8 through 14 remained gray and unplanted and under the faint pressure of 3 chicken tractors moving forward 6 feet each morning. Miriam stood at the boundary between the planted ground and the unplanted ground and looked south and then north. The planted strips showed nothing yet. They would not show anything for 8 to 12 days until germination, and even then what they showed would be small. She was not looking for what was there. She was looking at the ground itself, the surface texture of it, the way it lay. The planted strips lay differently than the unplanted strips. She could see it. She did not know if anyone else would be able to see it from the road, and it did not matter whether anyone could or not. She went to fill the waterers. The quilting frolic was held at Hannah Schlabach's house on a Thursday in early May, and Miriam went because she always went when she could, and because she needed thread, and Hannah kept a good supply. Ruth Baylor was there, and 4 other women from the district, and they sat around the frame with their needles and talked about the things that get talked about at quilting frolics, which includes everything. Ruth, at some point in the mid-afternoon, mentioned Miriam's south field, not to Miriam directly, but in the general conversation, in the way things get mentioned when the person they are about is in the room and everyone knows it. Ruth said she had heard the planting was in. She said she hoped it would do well. She said it in a tone that was kind and uncertain in equal measure, the tone of someone who has been wrong enough times to hedge, but who has not quite updated their underlying prediction. Miriam was threading a needle. She said, 35 hens. First 2 strips are in. The room was briefly quiet in the way rooms go, briefly quiet, when someone has said something that changes the texture of what everyone thought they were discussing. One of the other women, Mary Shetler, said, "You said 35. I thought it was 36. Miriam said she had lost 1 in March. She had not mentioned it because she had not been asked. A hen found at morning check, same as November, no evident cause. She had recorded it in the account book and updated the count, and that had been the whole of the response available to her. Mary Shetler said she was sorry to hear it. Miriam said thank you and bit her thread. Ruth said after a moment, "The first 2 strips. What's in them?" Miriam told her. "Beets, carrots, turnips, 1 test row of dry beans." Ruth said that was ambitious. Miriam said it was a start. She did not say what the penetrometer had read in March. She did not say what the pH had been. She did not say what 11 earthworms per square foot meant in soil that had shown 2. She did not say any of the things that were in the account book, because the account book was not finished, and because the thing about numbers is that they mean more when they are complete than when they are partial. And the story of what the South Field could do was still being written 1 morning at a time, 35 birds doing 6 feet a day, and she was not going to tell it before it was done. Ruth mentioned before Miriam left that Levi had heard she was planting into the South Field and had said in Ruth's hearing that he admired the persistence even if he wasn't sure about the method. Ruth said this as though it were a significant concession, which, in context, it was. Miriam folded the thread she had bought and put it in her pocket and said that was kind of Levi to say. She walked home through the early May evening, the light still in the sky past 7 o'clock, the smell of turned earth coming off the fields along the road. She was thinking about the dry bean row and whether the soil structure in Strip 1 was ready for a legume, or whether she had pushed it a season too early. She was not thinking about Levi Troyer or Ruth Byler or any of the things said in the quilting frolic room. She was thinking about roots and what they needed to go down. The germination in strips 1 and 2 came on the 11th day. The beets first. Small paired seed leaves in a row so straight it surprised her slightly because she had planted by eye and hand rather than a line guide. The carrots 3 days later, thread-like and pale, requiring her to get close to the ground to see them clearly. The turnips came fast after that, stockier, darker green, the kind of germination that looks like it means something. She did not compare them to the control strips yet, because there was nothing growing in the control strips to compare them to. And she was not in the business of comparing incomplete things to one another. The hens moved through strip 6 in May and into strip 7 in June. 35 birds doing 6 feet a day, morning after morning. The field marked in a regular grid of pen positions that she recorded in a separate column of the account book so she could confirm full coverage by strip. Full coverage meant the birds had walked every square foot of the strip at least once, which was a function of pen size, daily move distance, and strip width. She checked her records against the calculation every 2 weeks. In June, she took comparison readings in the control strips and the rehabilitated strips on the same day, using the same penetrometer, the same pH kit, the same earthworm counting method. Strip 1, 6 months after baseline, penetrometer 198 pI, pH 6.4, earthworms 19 per square foot. Strip 8, on rehab control, same day, penetrometer 321 psi, pH 5.8, earthworms 2 per square foot. She sat on an overturned bucket at the edge of the field and wrote all 6 numbers in the account book, 3 from strip 1 under their October baseline, 3 from strip 8 as a control column she had started in March. She looked at them for a while. The beet tops in strip 1 were 6 inches tall, and the color of them was the deep true green of a plant that is not struggling. She had grown beets in this field before. She knew what a struggling beet top looked like. It looked paler, and it grew slower, and the leaves had a faint yellowing at the edges that meant the roots were not finding what they needed. These beet tops were not struggling. They were doing something she did not have a precise word for, which was simply growing the way plants grow when the ground is ready for them. She took the bucket back to the barn and went to move the pens. Ezra Mast came by in the 3rd week of June on his way back from a delivery in the Charm area. He did not send word that he was coming. He drove past the property and then apparently decided to turn around because Miriam heard the buggy in the drive and came out to find him standing at the fence line, looking at the south field with an expression she could not immediately classify. She came to stand beside him. They both looked at the field. What Ezra was looking at was the difference between the northern half and the southern half of the field. The northern half, strips 1 through 5, had the chicken tractor work behind it, and in the 2 planted strips had visible crop growth. The southern half, strips 8 through 14, was the same gray compacted clay it had always been, with the 3 tractors working slowly across strip 8 and making no visible difference to the eye from the road. The line between them was not dramatic. It was not a before and after photograph, but it was not nothing. And Ezra had driven past this field every 2 or 3 weeks for 9 months, and he could see that it was not the same field it had been in September. He said, "The beets." She said, "Yeah." He said, "They look different than last year's." She said they were different than last year's because they were in different ground than last year's. She told him the penetrometer readings. She told him the pH. She told him about the earthworms, 19 per square foot in strip 1 against 2 per square foot in the unrehab control. She told him what a penetrometer reading of 198 meant versus 321, which is the difference between a root going down and a root going sideways, and between a root going sideways and a root giving up entirely, which is when you get bitter vegetables, cracked vegetables, small yields that the auction buyers pass over. Ezra listened. He was a careful listener, the same way he was a careful talker. He did not interrupt. When she was done, he said, "So the ground was never dead." She said, "No. It was depleted, compacted. It needed a question it hadn't been asked yet." He looked at the field a little longer. He said, "Are you going to do it again next season? Push the tractors through the rest." She said she had ground enough for 2 more seasons of rotation. She had already mapped the strips for the following year and calculated what she would need for feed if the hen count held. Ezra said, "And then what? After the whole field's through?" She thought about it. She said she would probably start a second rotation. Move the pens back to strip 1 in year 3 and see what a second pass did on ground that had already been through once. Ezra said quietly that she had thought this through. She said she'd had time. He looked at her. He had known her since they were children. He knew what that sentence carried. He did not say anything more about it, because there was nothing to say that would improve on the sentence, and he was wise enough to know that. He left without a ceremony. He drove back toward Charm. He stopped that Sunday, which was a church Sunday in his district, and said something to Levi Troyer after the meal. Miriam was not present for this. She was at her own district service at the Shetler farm, listening to Bishop Schlabach preach on steadfastness. She did not know what Ezra said to Levi. She found out some of it later through the same network by which all information in that district eventually reached everyone, which was Ruth Byler. Ruth told her at the end of July that Ezra had told Levi he ought to drive past the Yost South Field when he had a chance. She said Ezra had apparently been specific about what Levi should look for, which was the difference between the northern and southern halves. She said Levi had driven past the following Wednesday on his way to the elevator and had not said much to anyone afterward, which Ruth considered significant. Levi not saying much was a different thing than Levi having nothing to observe. Miriam was at the cold frame checking the beet sizing when Ruth told her this. She pressed her thumb against the shoulder of a beet near the surface of the soil, feeling its diameter. She said, "That's kind of him to take an interest." Ruth said she thought it was more than interest. Miriam pulled the beet. It came out clean and straight and the right size, and the color of it, that deep garnet red, was the color of a root vegetable that has had enough of what it needed and has used it correctly. She weighed it in her hand. She said, 35 hens, Ruth. 9 months of moving. That's all it was. Ruth watched her. She said, "Hannah Schlabach says you work like someone who doesn't need anything to be easy." Miriam set the beet in the harvest crate. She thought about Jonas at the kitchen table being calm about pain that was not calm pain. She thought about the plastic chair in the corridor in Millersburg. She thought about the account book and the winter evenings and the penetrometer reading in March and the 11 earthworms and then the 19 earthworms and what it means for something to be not finished when everyone else has decided it is finished. She said, "Not finished yet." Ruth thought she meant the harvest. Miriam let her think that, because it was also true of the harvest, and some things do not require the full explanation. The late summer auction at Walnut Creek ran the last Saturday of August. Miriam loaded the wagon the night before. Beets, 12 bunches of 6. The roots clean and sized in uniform. In a way, her beets had not been in 3 years. Carrots, 10 pounds in paper sleeves. Turnips, 8 pounds. The dry beans, which she had not expected to be commercial, had produced 17 pounds of dried Jacob's cattle beans from the single test row, which she had shelled and cleaned and bagged in half-pound paper bags because she did not know what else to do with them and she wanted to see what the market said. She set up her table in the usual spot near the south end of the cellar's floor before 7 in the morning. By 8:30, the floor was busy. She sold 6 bunches of beets before 9 o'clock. which was 3 more than she had sold in the previous full season combined. The buyers who stopped at her table were not making conversation about the beets. They were buying them, which is a different and more useful form of attention. At 9:15, Carol Dresser came through the south end of the floor. Carol Dresser was 53 years old and had been buying produce at this auction for 11 years on behalf of a restaurant in Millersburg that she had run for 15. She wore a canvas apron with a front pocket that held a small paring knife and a folded notepad and a stubby pencil. She did not stop at every table. She moved down the floor at a pace that suggested she had already decided most of what she intended to buy before she arrived. She stopped at Miriam's table. She picked up a bunch of beets. She turned them. She looked at the color of the leaves, which is the first thing a buyer who knows what she is doing looks at, because the leaves tell you how recently the root was pulled and how well it was grown. She set them down and picked up a single beet from the open display and pulled the small knife from her apron pocket and cut the beet cleanly across its equator. The cut surface was the dark, even red of a well-grown Detroit dark red, with no pale center, no white zoning, no fibrous rings. She looked at it for a moment. She did not taste it immediately. She looked up at Miriam. She said, "What changed?" Not a compliment. A question. The question of someone who had bought Miriam's beets 2 years ago and set them back down and remembered both the setting down and the reason for it. Miriam told her. She told her about Schuster's fence line strip. She told her about 41 hens at 75 cents a head, and the 3 wooden chicken tractors, and 6 feet a day for 9 months, and the penetrometer readings, and the earthworms. She told her plainly and in the order it had happened and without any editorializing. It took about 4 minutes. Carol Dresser listened the way Ezra had listened without interrupting, the knife still in her hand. When Miriam finished, Carol tasted the cut surface of the beet. She was quiet for a moment. She said, 40 pounds of mixed roots. Can you do that? Miriam said she could do 35 today and the rest by Tuesday if she could deliver. Carol said she had a standing arrangement with a driver, and she could send him Tuesday afternoon. She asked the price. Miriam said $1.10 a pound. Carol said that was fair and wrote it on the notepad and tore the page and gave it to Miriam, and that was the transaction. 40 pounds at $1.10, $44 and a Tuesday standing arrangement, and the quiet confirmation that the thing Miriam had spent 9 months and $30 and 75 cents and a great deal of early mornings building had produced something that a person who knew the difference could tell, apart from what she had produced before. Levi Troyer came through the seller's floor at 10:30. He was not a regular buyer at the produce auction, but he sometimes came to look at equipment in the outdoor section and occasionally walked the floor. He moved through it the way a large man moves through a crowded space, without hurrying, with the assumption that the space will accommodate him. He came to Miriam's table and stopped. He looked at what was left of the beets. He looked at the carrots. He looked at the half-pound bags of Jacob's cattle beans, which he would not have expected. He picked up a bunch of beets and looked at the roots the same way Carol Dresser had, though without the knife, and he set them back down. He said, "That's from the south field." Not a question. He had driven past it in July. He had seen the difference between the northern half and the southern half. He was a man who had farmed for 40 years, and he knew what a rehabilitated strip looked like versus a dead one. And he knew that the roots on Miriam's table did not come from dead ground. Miriam said, "Yeah, 35 hens, about 9 months of moving." Levi looked at the table for another moment. He nodded once. He moved on through the floor. That was all. No retraction of his earlier position, no acknowledgement that he had been wrong about the ground or about what the chickens could do. Just the nod, which, in the language of a 63-year-old Holmes County corn farmer who had been confident in his assessment and had turned out to be incorrect, was the whole of the available acknowledgement, and Miriam received it as what it was, which was sufficient. She sold out the remaining beets and the carrots by noon. She sold 6 of the 17 bags of dry beans, which she had not expected. She drove home with an empty wagon bed and the notepad page from Carol Dresser in her apron pocket, and the account book with all its columns, the numbers running down the page from September to August, each one dated and plain. The south field behind the farm was still more gray than it was not. Strips 9 through 14 had not yet been touched. The 3 chicken tractors were sitting in their end-of-day positions at the top of strip 9, the hens roosting inside them. The evening coming down over the field in the long, slow way it comes down at the end of August. There was more work to do in that field. 2 more seasons of it, at minimum, to bring the remaining strips to what strips 1 and 2 were now. The account book had columns for all of it. Miriam went out the next morning at 5:15. She found the pull bar in the pre-dawn, her hand going to the worn center of it where the wood was smooth from use. The ground was warm, summer warm still, the air carrying the smell of the dry grass in the field below the house. She leaned into the bar and the chicken tractor moved forward 6 feet, the runners quiet on the loose soil of strip 9, and inside the pen the hens shuffled and found their feet and settled without alarm. She looked at the ground behind the pen. The scratched soil in the first morning light was darker than the gray ground surrounding it. Not transformed, not finished, just darker, which was the beginning of what darker becomes with enough mornings applied to it. She let go of the bar and went to fill the waterers. The south field was not dead. It never had been. This story is not about chickens, not exactly, and it is not about soil chemistry, though both matter and both are true. It is about the difference between a thing that is finished and a thing that is depleted, and about the specific kind of patience required to work on something that shows nothing for weeks and months, to record the numbers in a small account book in the evenings when the numbers are not yet impressive, to move the pen 6 feet forward every morning, because that is what 6 feet a day accumulates to over 9 months, which is the length of a field and the beginning of a recovery. Miriam Yost knew something that is easy to say and very hard to actually do, which is that you do not get to know whether something is finished until you have stayed with it long enough to find out. The ground taught her that. She had also learned it elsewhere, in harder circumstances, and the ground and the harder circumstances had between them made her into someone who could look at a gray dead field in September and see not what it was, but what it had not yet been asked to become. If this story found you at the right moment, share it with someone who's been told what they have isn't worth the trouble. Drop your city in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. And if you've ever checked something everyone else had already written off, I want to hear what you found.